Today's session is part of the Garrison Institute's continued work to advance and support the field of moral economics. And I want to give you an overview of what that means for us. Our human world swims in an ocean of mental models, and they are of our own construction. And those mental models are organized in the contemporary world by a framework which we call the economy. By the way, in the past, they weren't always. And we're told that this follows laws like supply and demand, and incentives motivate behavior, and the growth is good. But these are just laws that we made up. And the consequence of these laws is that we're seeing enormous income inequality, biodiversity loss. We're seeing climate change. We're seeing completely unaffordable housing, healthcare, childcare, elder care in the United States and many other countries. So we have a system that we totally made up. It doesn't work. It's not achieving the outcomes that as a society we should really want. But we are lucky because today we have 8 amazing thinkers who have been working on what would be the economic system that actually could solve some of these problems, that could reorganize this mental structure to align it with the actual needs that we need. One more thing, I want to just distinguish between the phrase economy and economics. So economics is a mental construct. It's a way of viewing the world and aligning relations. And economies are the actual things that take place on the ground in communities. And they vary enormously based on culture, on values, on ecosystems, on bioregions. And so we are calling this program Moral Economies because we're really grounded in the real stuff that is taking place on the ground. Anna Muoio, who's one of our speakers, wrote me recently, and she actually wrote a LinkedIn post and said, you know, when you feel a groundswell, it feels like an extensive swell moving through an equally vast ocean. It may not be a huge wave sighted from the land, and it may not even be seen or felt by many, but it is there, undeniably so. And she was saying is that this view of moral economy is a groundswell, and it is rising in this ocean in which we all live, and it's going to be transformational. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests. We're going to start with Amanda Janoo, who is the Economics and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. John Fullerton then will follow, Chairman of Day Enterprises and the co-founder of Grasslands Institute, but he's here as the founder of the Capital Institute and Regenerative Capitalism. Samantha Power, the co-founder and director of the BioFi Project, and the founder and principal consultant for Finance for Gaia. Enith Williams, the managing director of the Reparations Finance Lab and an advisor to 17 Asset Management. Anna Muoio, who's the founder of the Theory of We and is talking about the New Economic Coalition. Dominic Hofstetter, who is the space building lead for TransCap, who's talking about systems change in economics. Justin Winter, who's the co-founder and executive director of One Earth, and Liz Grant, the assistant principal and director of the Global Health Academy at the University of Edinburgh and a leading thing in compassion. So thank you, amazing panel. We're so glad that you're with us. And now let's begin with Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining in the world. I'm just going to share a presentation with you all today. So as Jonathan mentioned, my name is Amanda. I work at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEALL, which is a global collaboration of organizations, academics, governments, change makers, movements from all over the world that are really trying to transform our economic system so that it works in service of people and planet's well-being. And one of our claims to fame is that we help to develop the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And so Jonathan asked me to share a little bit about the types of practical, real-life innovations we're seeing amongst governments to actually transform our economic system. And so I just want to put a little caveat here that governments are not always the most radical actors in our space, but they do play a really critical role within our contemporary economic system. And so I'm excited to sort of share with you first what we're seeing at the national level, and then also some exciting innovations at the global and local as well before closing. And so around the world, we're starting to see some governments beginning to recognize that the singular focus on economic growth is being accompanied by really negative social or environmental outcomes. And so they recognize that we're going to need to really shift not just the way we think, but the way we act, and really critically, the way that we're measuring success. And part of this is because the sort of standard policy approach of just growing the economy as quickly as you can to increase national income so that you can take some of that wealth through taxes to fix any of the damages that are done to people and planet in the process is just not really working anymore. The increasing frequency and severity of the social, political, environmental, et cetera, crises that are being generated by this economic system is making governments recognize that they need to move upstream and get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting in terms of delivering on the societal goals. But the major reason is actually because, as always, people are the ones who are calling for change. And so around the world, the majority of people now see capitalism as doing more harm than good. And they see the governments as working in the interests of a small group of economic elites. So they're losing faith in governments, seeing democracy as being eroded, and that very much as being in connection with our current economic system. But I think what's important to recognize is that people don't just see the issue, they also are seeing the solution. So across G20 countries, we could say the supposed winners of the current economic system, 68% of people really believe that the economy should be designed in a way that prioritizes the health and well-being of people and nature rather than profit and wealth. And this is really at the heart of the Wellbeing Economy movement, which comes under a lot of different banners around the world. Solidarity economy, regenerative economy, just transition, post-growth, degrowth, and many more. But at its heart is this recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start getting the economy, treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so one manifestation of this movement has been the development of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, which began with New Zealand, Iceland, and Scotland coming together as an informal partnership. And I just want to note here that at that time, they were all led by women or female heads of state. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. But they recognized that they needed to develop new definitions of progress that moved beyond GDP and really centered social and ecological well-being. And since their founding, Finland, Wales, Canada have joined, and now Australia, Ireland, and potentially even Brazil this year will be joining as well as part of this partnership. And all of those governments have developed alternative indicators centered in social and ecological well-being. But it's important to mention that this is very much inspired by Bhutan's gross national happiness framework, as they were very much the sort of pioneers in this space. And so how does this actually manifest? What does this look like? How are governments moving to a well-being economy? Well, the first step is generally to understand or define what we mean by well-being in the first place. And so in Wales, for example, they went about a process of asking all of their citizens, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And on this basis, they developed these 7 high-level well-being goals around global responsibility, equity, resilience, which I think is important to note is really centered in biodiversity, and even prosperity is about having an innovative, productive society that respects planetary boundaries. And then the next step tends to be, once there is clarity on the well-being sort of vision, to actually craft and communicate that, which I should say from my experience is governments are terrible at the communication side. And so oftentimes they will reflect this well-being vision in the form of an infographic like this. And it's important to note here that they tell very different stories. So the one on my sort of left is from Canada. And here we see the environment as being viewed as one part or one aspect of well-being. Whereas the donut economics framework, which many of you may be familiar with, love Kate Rayworth, views the environment or the ecological sort of as a boundary or constraint on humanity's sort of well-being. And then one on the right is from New Zealand when they engaged their Maori indigenous population to develop a well-being framework. The green circle is really at the center with spirit or morals or values being the yellow. And so in their view, the environment or nature is the foundation or center of all life and flourishing. And so the ways that we craft and communicate these well-being visions are really critical for understanding our perceived relationship between the dimensions and also their sort of in their hierarchy in some way. And so once you have that vision or the dimensions of well-being, governments generally then go to the measurement or developing indicators that can help them to assess. And this is where I've noticed most governments tend to get stuck. So this is an example from Australia where they develop a ton of indicators around social, environmental, economic, and they throw them in a soup. And then they get kind of confused because they're not really sure how to make sense of all of those different dimensions and their interrelationship or how to make strategic decisions on that basis. And part of this, I think, is because we've held the economy as superior for so long that we tend to still feel like it's just needs to be viewed as its own mechanism of production, income, sort of wealth generation, when the reality is we sort of need to downgrade the economy and recognize that it's just one aspect of our societies embedded within a larger ecosystem. And even though this is intuitive, it's a big shift because we've all become so accustomed to the supremacy of the economy that we feel the need to make the case, for example, of why health is good for the economy, rather than feeling like we can swap that burden of proof and ask and evaluate the economy by its contribution to our health. But we are seeing some governments making this important next step. So in Iceland, for example, they developed a really ambitious well-being strategy where they recognize that the types of dimensions that we need to be transforming within our economy are quite wide ranged as well as across our society. And they include in here, for example, discouraging materialism, which I really love because that's not something that you normally see in a government strategy, but they recognize that that's really core if we want to ensure thriving, sustainable societies. And then the next step is really about recognizing that the system of governance itself really needs to be transformed because democracy and economy are really inextricably interlinked in terms of its power and relational dimensions. And so Wales is my favorite example in this regard, as on the basis of those 7 goals, they passed a legislation that required all state agencies to work collectively towards the achievement of those 7 goals, to take a long-term and preventative approach. So not just focusing on putting out fires, but really preventing any of those crises in the first place. And what this ended up meaning in practice was, for example, when they wanted to develop a new highway through a nature preserve, the Future Generations Commissioner, who's also developed out of this legislation, who I should note, tenure is always longer than any political administration, so that they can always maintain across political administrations and cycles, made them explain how this highway was going to contribute to a more resilient, healthier, equitable, etc. Wales. And they couldn't make the case for contributing to any of these goals except for maybe one. So they ended up putting a freeze on all new highway development so that that money would go into active travel and public transportation instead, which they could make the case for contributing to all goals. And I just want to note here that this legislation didn't just magically appear, but was really a result of over a decade of really dedicated effort by a civil servant within the environmental ministry, who was able to gather a wide range of civil society partners to strategically advocate to the government at a moment when it felt like they were open for this type of transformative legislation. And similarly, last year we saw Ireland hosting a citizens' assembly on biodiversity. And one of the chief recommendations that came out of this was actually a constitutional referendum around the rights of nature. And so there has been a preliminary acceptance amongst the parliament for a draft legislation around this. But what they've realized was that when Ecuador or other countries pass similar types of laws around the rights of nature, they didn't take away the rights of property. And in the end, the rights of property would always end up trumping the rights of nature. And so what Ireland is doing is looking into actually pre-English, pre-colonial legal traditions to really find a much more transformative understanding of people's relationship to nature, land, and property as precedents for a much more profound transformation of their legal systems. And so I want to pause here for a second and say that all sounds good. And there is a lot of really exciting momentum at the national level, but none of these governments are immune from a lot of the anti-globalist, anti-government sort of fascist winds that are brewing, as New Zealand and Finland now have more right-wing governments that are challenging the well-being agenda. And obviously within the United States, the recent elections have really illustrated that people feel that government has just been a henchman for global corporate and financial interests, and so have lost faith in their capacity and are yearning for some security against the ravages of the market. And when offered the options of continued corporate globalization or authoritarian nationalism, they chose the latter. And so I think we really need to be clear that this is not something that can be solved by any government itself in isolation. We need a global strategy that can provide a hopeful third alternative to fascism or neoliberalism, but also is oriented towards making space for self-determination at the local level. And so we are seeing some exciting innovations at the global level amongst governance and government initiatives. So for example, last year, the UN Special Rapporteur for Poverty Alleviation and Human Rights really started a whole movement to advance post-growth thinking in the next iteration of the SDGs to make clear that economic growth is actually not essential for poverty alleviation and to really challenge that fundamental starting point. I think the global minimum tax standard is one of the most hopeful developments we've seen at the global level, as this is where governments are finally recognizing that they need to come together to create some constraints and standards for multinational corporations. And we're seeing governments like the Wellbeing Economy Forum, where these governments are coming together to really learn from each other, but also to think strategically. And so the next Wellbeing Economy Governments Forum will be in May in Iceland. And so I'll post it in the link because I would love for you all to join. But what I want to emphasize here is that global innovations and narratives and governance reforms are critical, but we cannot reproduce the top-down, one-size-fits-all economic thinking or approaches of the past. And we really need to be focused on empowering people-led participatory processes of economic transformation. And so I'm just going to close here and say that, at least as an American, I've obviously been feeling pretty bummed about the recent elections and fearful for the state of this country. But when I look to the state level, there are a lot of really exciting innovations which are giving me hope. So in Washington State, for example, they have been piloting really innovative new visions for governance where they have been defining well-being by centering people with lived experience, the ones who have the most to really benefit most from these transformations. And they are the first government to actually use government funds to host people's assemblies around issues of climate change, economic justice, and poverty alleviation to really empower their active voice and participation in this transformation. And I think for me, also recognizing that a lot of the countries and examples I've given are very much centered in the West. And I don't believe that we are going to be the drivers of the solutions, that we really need to look to indigenous and majority world paradigms that can offer genuine alternative understandings of our relationship to one another and our natural world. And in Hawaii, there's an incredible movement called the Aina Aloha Economic Futures, where a group of Native Hawaiians came together and they articulated a whole new vision for economic development based in their traditional values, but they were very smart because they transformed it into a form that us sort of Western colonial thinkers would find legitimate as an Excel spreadsheet that would rank an economic development initiative, project, etc., by whether or not it was bad for Hawaii or good in terms of systemic change for Hawaii. And they were able to get this adopted by the Hawaiian Tourism Authority, by just recently the Economic Development Authority, and I've been leading in a really transformative strategies around circular economy and regenerative economy across the state. And so I'll just say, what we're trying to do and recognize is that government transformation is critical, but that comes by building people power, and that this needs to happen at all levels. And so we try to work and be the sort of connector between the layers and the players and build that movement needed for meaningful paradigm shift and transformation. So I'll just end by saying thank you, and I hope you all check us out and join the movement. Thanks.
Nice to be here with all of you today to be talking about this very exciting topic. Amanda, thank you for your amazing presentation. So many interlinkages with what we're working on at the BioFi Project. So today I'll be talking to you all about bioregional financing for planetary regeneration. So as most of you here are probably well aware, probably why you came to this webinar today, we are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. And as a result, there is this wave of capital that is forming that is committed to investing in regenerating the biosphere. But there is a gap, and I have witnessed this gap in many of the places that I have worked, the World Bank, with the UN, with investors, in the connectivity between regenerative projects and funders, noting that many of these projects are small scale and grassroots and eligible to those funders, in socio-ecological integrity. Current financing approaches often perpetuate the extractive processes and power structures that are driving the ecological and broader polycrisis. And in worldview and language, capital is rarely deployed in alignment with a living systems approach that sees the earth as a living, breathing, interdependent, and indeed sacred organism. And so we have been developing this bioregional financing facility template that we believe can close the gap between funders and regenerators, and are working on creating a new layer of bioregional financing facilities in the global financial architecture, designed to enable flows of resources from increasingly centralized pools of capital to grassroots regenerative projects and initiatives in alignment with living systems principles and Indigenous wisdom. And bioregional financing facilities, or BFFs as we like to call them, have three objectives. They drive the decentralization of financial resource governance, they organize synergistic portfolios of projects, and they catalyze the transition to a regenerative economy. And through these three objectives, we believe that bioregional financing facilities are different than any financial institution that's been created to date. They have 12 attributes. I won't go through all of them right now, but I will highlight a few. The first and most central is that they aim to align with living systems principles and Indigenous wisdom. And here we've really drawn on Fridtjof Capra's work on living systems principles and how life is inherently regenerative, creative, networked, and emergent. And we're designing financing facilities that draw on those principles and those fundamental truths about life on planet Earth. Bioregional financing facilities serve a long-term bioregional regeneration strategy that works at a quite large geographic scale across a landscape or a watershed or a species migratory pattern, like where the salmon are on the Pacific coast or where the buffalo have been and could be again as we create a migratory corridor for them. They work to shift power imbalances, and this is something that we are quite committed to and have seen very few other financial institutions take on. They enable empowered participation, they leverage an integrated capital structure, they treat growth and returns as a means, but not an end. We just heard from Amanda on how a laser focus on growth has led so many governments astray from meeting the needs of their citizens. And so there are 4 bioregional financing facilities templates that we are working with that we lay out in the BioFi book. The first of which is a bioregional trust, which essentially functions as a catalytic grant facility to invest in bioregional organizing, activation, planning, and various regenerative initiatives in a bioregion, and can pilot really cool structures that are leveraging the rights of nature and giving mountains or rivers their own wallet and their own portfolio of contracts that they can hold and exercise. The Bioregional Venture Studio incubates a cohort of entrepreneurs that are working together as an ecosystem to shift a particular lever in the bioregion and transform a system. The bioregional investment company comes later once there's a portfolio of regenerative projects that is able to take larger amounts of capital and perhaps generate financial returns. And last is a bioregional bank, which can function similar to a community development financial institution in the US, can offer low interest loans, lines of credit, technical assistance to regenerative organizations in the bioregion, but can also develop and issue its own currency. And bioregional financing facilities fund a range of regenerative actions while generating 4 returns. And it's quite central in BioFi and in our work that we take a more holistic approach to viewing risk and returns. And indeed, we believe that the myopic way in which the current financial system views risks and returns is short-sighted and is going to lead to the value of financial portfolios eroding over time as we're focused on essentially sucking up the earth and turning it into money and taking a very short-term view of risk and not looking at the full range of risks that our current economy and current financial system are generating through their investments. So we look at the 4 returns framework that Common Land has developed, starting with inspiration. And from inspiration, you get regenerative action and you can realize ecological returns. From those ecological returns, there are so many social returns that are generated. And from those social returns flow economic and financial returns. So the BioFi Project is a nonprofit collective that we launched on the solstice, the summer solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere, just 6 months ago. And we are working to support bioregions to design, create, capitalize, implement, and evolve bioregional financing facilities. Since the launch of the BioFi Project, we have published the BioFi book, which you can find for free or for purchase if you want a hard copy on our website. We've been working on spreading the BioFi meme in amazing gatherings like this and in meetings with philanthropists and investors and multilaterals and governments who are interested in supporting more community-led approaches to financing regeneration. We have created and grown our BioFi community of practice to more than 430 bioregional regenerators from around the world. And we've received more than 50 applications from bioregional organizing teams around the world to work with us to create the first bioregional financing facilities. We have begun the launch of our BioFi cultivator, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we ran an inaugural bioregional Gitcoin round, a crowdfunding round that I will also talk a little bit more about. So we have, through this process, developed relationships with bioregional partners who are ready to engage in place-based systemic investing. I know many folks on the call today are really passionate about bringing systems design to how we invest, to how we structure financing facilities. And we believe that there's an urgency right now to deploy those approaches in a place-based way that are rooted in teams that have connectivity and trust in the places where they're working. So through our community of practice, through an interview process that we carried out, convening trainings, our crowdfunding program, we have built a network of what we think are highly sophisticated bioregional partners that represent a huge opportunity to land systemic investing in place. So here you can see some of the teams that we have been in relationship with and have been getting to know. They are around the world. And in October, we ran the first bioregional round, crowdfunding round on this platform called Gitcoin, which has been used predominantly by the Web3 community, but has recently added a PayPal integration. So a Web3 wallet is not required to participate in this round. And Gitcoin uses something called quadratic funding to uplift the projects that the community believes are most compelling and most in need of funding. And then there's a matching pool of funding that is allocated according to how many donations and the amount of those donations that each project gets. So we curated 14 different bioregional organizing teams who went through that round. I can share the link to that page so you can learn a little bit more about those teams and what they're up to and what they're doing with these funds to further develop their BioFi readiness, their ability to start designing bioregional financing facilities. In our BioFi community of practice, we have been facilitating peer-to-peer learning and coordination, sharing resources, sharing needs, and connecting people that are working in the BioFi space. And in a very short period of time, less than 6 months, this community has grown to more than 430 participants. We organize a BioFi deep dive call once a month and a BioFi field building call, and would love to see some of you there. You can watch some of the recordings of these on our YouTube channel. And in January, we're very excited to be launching our BFF Cultivator, where we're going to take 18 bioregional organizing teams through a process to create bioregional financing facilities with a curriculum that builds on what's laid out in the BioFi book. But we're really going to be learning with each other together what it means to apply these principles in a design process. And we'll be launching BioFi design principles that communities outside of the cultivator can also use that are inspired by permaculture principles, rainwater harvesting principles, my friend John Fullerton's regenerative economic principles, and principles of indigenous economics. The BioFi Project is working with bioregional organizing teams to build their capacity, enhance their storytelling ability, provide technological and procedural expertise, including connecting them to our amazing network of partners, and facilitate learning and coordination so that together this portfolio of bioregional financing facilities that's being curated is greater than the sum of its parts. And folks that want to invest in bioregional financing facilities can find a whole portfolio of them that are working together to catalyze the transition to place-based bioregional economies that are supporting each other. So I think I will wrap up by just showing my amazing team that I am working with to bring BFFs to life. You can learn more about all these amazing people at biofi.earth. Here you can see some of the partners that we're working with to create these facilities and to design all the technical modular components of that, from bringing in Earth Law to designing MRV strategies to creating and selling eco credits, the application of donor advised funds. We have so many amazing partners here. And just want to close by sharing a call to bioregional action, to encouraging all of you participating today to think about your place in terms of hard lines, soft lines, and human lines, geological lines, ecological lines, and the cultural lines that define the place where you are, and to ask you to think about organizing outside of political boundaries and to really imagine what is possible when we're not working within the existing system, but we're creating a system that makes the old system obsolete. And I'll close there.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Samantha. And John, you've got your share. We're talking about a sharing economy, and you got your share button working. So, Don Fullerton.
So, Samantha, you were echoing Bucky Fuller there at the end, which is wonderful to see. I thought just as a quick transition in my short amount of time for everyone that may be new to this regenerative idea, it's become quite a popular word. And the thing to understand is regeneration means the process of life. Nothing more, but nothing less than that. And so Samantha's amazing work is very much, in my view, the foundation layer of a regenerative economy or regenerative economies. And the well-being economy is implicit and embedded in a regenerative economy. And yet not all approaches to a well-being economy are grounded in the regenerative process. So there's distinctions and great overlap as well. So I've got a quick set of slides to keep me on task. Okay, Jonathan's invocation of a moral economy had me really thinking, particularly in light of some recent events. And so just as a quick grounding, we have built economies on looting since Genghis Khan. And we've replaced looting, we've replaced the swords of looting with suits and corruption. This took on a accelerated and amplified path here in the United States with the Powell Memo back in the 1970s, which led directly to Citizens United decision that said that corporations are people and that money is speech. And so we now have a government on the payroll of the capital interests in the United States, and it's a remarkably cheap and effective methodology. And we seem to be unable to escape this even while we watch our kids' suicide rates rise and our kids slaughtered in schools again as recently as this week. The corporate media's reporting on the vigilante murder focused on the killer and not the cause. A sophisticated friend of mine suggested that the reason we all watch drug commercials on television is to get the media addicted to their advertising revenues. It's a pretty dark thought. And now, of course, we have people who are corporations. Stunningly, Elon Musk's personal market cap is twice that of Goldman Sachs, 3.5 times the most powerful military company in the country, and 10 times Ford Motor Company. So we have an immoral economy. And the challenge of this is bigger than I think we can possibly get our heads around. It was said very nicely and succinctly by Wendell Berry, our economy has become an anti-economy, a financial system without a sound economic basis and without economic virtues, and I'm sure he would agree, morals. So how did we get here? And what do we do about it? One thing to think about is that our thinking about morals is very much an individualistic thing. And yet now we understand that everything is connected to everything. That's the physics. And so we need to actually think about systemic ethics, not just individual ethics. And another little point to keep in mind that all economic development begins with a surplus. Unfortunately, most of the economic development that has been successful, that surplus was created by theft. The British East India Company, for example, had a standing army of 260,000 and literally expropriated the textile industry from India, which at the time represented 25% of the global economy. It's a stunning fact to contemplate. Now, why do we have an economic system that is so broken? And I'm going to focus on theory a bit here because I don't have time to talk about theory and practice. But neoclassical economics and its offspring, what I call the finance algorithm, financial management as we teach it in schools, is essentially the system that we run the world on today. But it's built on a fatally flawed foundation of Newtonian physics. It's literally believed to be true, but it is not true. And if you need any evidence of this, you only need to see the Nobel Prize in Economics awarded in 2018 to a man who suggested that 3.5 degrees warming is the optimal target because anything lower would cost too much. The field of neoclassical economics is the discipline that we run the world on, and I believe it is fundamentally bankrupt, even though there are a lot of smart, well-meaning people that work in that field. So the gig is up. The double bind of all time is that undifferentiated economic growth generally does create economic value, but it also has become systemically suicidal. And our best ideas of shrinking and sharing are, in my opinion, inadequate given how far gone or how far over the edge we already are. Of course, we need to shrink and actually eliminate a lot of things from our economy. And of course, we need to share in a fundamentally different way. But we also need a new way to think about this whole challenge. And that's why I've become so passionate about not thinking I can figure out the answer to this, but relying on the process that explains how life works. And that moves us out of a purely materialist approach to problem solving. And it requires us to, in a sense, what's the word? Surrender to the genius that explains how life itself works. I believe this is a metamorphosis that we're going through, not just a modification or a rearrangement. And I believe it's a metamorphosis where we don't yet know what the butterfly looks like. So we happen to be living in a moment of change that is not just a moment of change, but a change in era, bigger than the shift from the medieval era to the modern era, where we're going to need to learn to see the world through new eyes. And one way to think about this really brief, important distinction is that we've become very good at understanding things that are complicated. Our mechanistic, materialistic, reductionist logic teaches us how to solve reductionist, complicated problems. But complicated is profoundly different than complexity. So, for example, anything we make is complicated, yet things we try to manage are complex. The economy is complex, and the economy is therefore, complexity is not well suited to goals and measures and metrics that we decide for ourselves. We don't actually manage complexity. We need to learn to dance with complexity, and that's where our first principles come in, to align with the first principles that explain how life works and hold our goals lightly because we can't possibly predict and know where that butterfly is going to exist. So very briefly, the premises of a regenerative economy are first that the human economy is a living system. And that's probably the most important thing I'll say today. And we can have a long discussion about that. The second is that there are patterns and principles that describe how all living systems that sustain themselves actually work in the real world. That's a true statement. That is now living system science. Premise 3, therefore, is that if the human economy is to be sustainable, to generate well-being over the long run, then its system design must also align with these same patterns and principles that explain how life works. Now, I'm going to skip this for time purposes. Like Samantha said, I too draw on Fritjof Capra's framework. Fritjof's been thinking about living systems since he wrote the Tao of Physics in the 1970s or 80s. And he has 4 principles that describe life. First, it's structured in networks. Second, it is regenerative. I believe it's the first time I've heard Fritjof use the term regenerative. Third, it's creative. And fourth, it's intelligent. And I've defined those as the structure of life, this holistic structure, the process of life. Regeneration is the process of life. And for me, the creative aspect of life is the essence of life. And finally, the fact that life is intelligent is the miracle of life. The 8 principles I've developed I've plenty of information on my website if you're interested to learn more or join our course, are remarkably aligned with the world's ancient wisdom traditions. Not by design. I developed them through studying living system science, but you can then see, if you look at them, how aligned they are with our ancient wisdom traditions, and in particular, indigenous wisdom, as Samantha mentioned. So what we're seeing, this change of era, I believe, is if the modern age separated science and spirit for lots of good reasons, this new unitive era is reconnecting our latest science, not Newtonian science, but our latest science, with the wisdom traditions that have stood the test of time. So this is a paradigm shift, and Bill Reed's beautiful diagram shows the distinction between our degenerative, mechanistic design of the materialist world, which is derived or built on reductionist thinking and focusing on parts, to this more regenerative way of seeing, which requires holistic thinking and a focus on patterns, not on the parts. But there's a profound shift in incrementally moving from the left to the right when you reach this regenerative paradigm, where ultimately what we're doing is a focus on creating conditions for health and letting go of the outcome. So we need to hold our goals a bit looser, because the well-being that we desire is likely to come from directions we can't possibly anticipate in advance. And that's not my opinion. That is actually how life has worked on this planet and in this universe throughout its time. Now, as a finance person, I'm very aware that financial ideology, theory, and practice is really the elephant in the room. And I've gotten myself clobbered many times by criticizing finance, because, as Thomas Merton said, when I criticize the system, they think I'm criticizing them. And that's because they accept the system and identify themselves with it. I've experienced that many, many times. But in brief, what I call the finance algorithm has a grip on our lives. It puts finance at the top to optimize return on capital. It looks at the economy as the game. The economy then organizes civilization and resources from the planet in such a way as to optimize return on financial capital. And that is essentially the system we designed intentionally to run the world, and it clearly doesn't work. It might have worked on smaller scale, but it doesn't work at the current scale. But you'll remember I said earlier that any economic development requires beginning with a surplus. And now we have a surplus, except that it's way out of balance. The surplus that we were born with, which is our natural capital and human ingenuity, has been degraded and extracted from, to the point where we have this massive pile of financial capital, and it needs to somehow be recycled, composted back into social and natural capital. And this is obviously a vast simplification. I actually am done. For me, this is what I lose sleep over at night, is how to actually create the worldview that understands that the health of the whole is dependent on this financial capital cycling, just as all things in life cycle. And at one level, this feels a little bit like we need to do more philanthropy. But this is on a scale that we haven't yet contemplated. Someone gave me an estimate that if you sum up all of financial capital, it adds up to $1,000 trillion. I don't know if that's right or not. I know it's more than $500 trillion. This is the money sitting in sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, foundation endowments, billionaires' bank accounts, and even the 0.1% bank accounts. And we've created a system that's designed to continue to accumulate this, as opposed to recycle this and keep this in the system. And Samantha's bioregional financing facilities are one of many obvious targets for this capital to be recycled. And how we do that, I believe, will require a shift in worldview so that we can see that this is a living system essential requirement and not a feel-good, do-good moral imperative or viewed as some sort of left-wing progressive idea. This is actually, if the human economy is a living system, this is actually a requirement of living systems, just as obeying the law of gravity is a requirement of designing an airplane. And if this is intriguing to you, I would love to share a lot more about it. We teach a course a couple times a year, an 8-week online course called Introduction to Regenerative Economics. There's also a finance course. The next economics course will begin in late February or March. I can't remember, but go to our website and you'll find information about it. Thanks, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Inspirational. Okay, next comes Enith Williams, and she's going to talk about the Reparations Finance Lab. And so far, all of our speakers have put on the table the idea of that we've lived in an economic system that's been quite extractive, and have been proposing solutions for how to return what we've extracted. And Enith is going to do part of that. Enith, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And it is such a pleasure to be joining everyone in this very, very important conversation. And as I begin, I'd also like to introduce a co-presenter with me, Pedro Henriquez de Silva from the Sierra Club Foundation. And Pedro and I, over the past year, have been working at the intersection of the environment and racial justice. And we think that there's a conversation for reparations, reparative capital, reparative conversations that centers the environment, but also at the nexus at where we see environmental racism, environmental capitalism really, really impacting historically on communities of color. Pedro, if you could begin the presentation, please. So the presentation begins. And, you know, when immediately before we came on, there was a conversation in the prep room about how many terms do we have for what it is that we are trying to do. And I think we were up to 100. So there's a moral economy, the regenerative economy, the new economy, the circular economy. And it speaks to the fact that we know that we are living in a foundationally, absolutely immoral economy. Something is not right. And when you find that everyone is trying to find a word to describe something, it speaks to the fact that there is this movement of discomfort, but we have not yet settled on the appropriate term. Next slide, please. And so I like to begin my presentations with a land acknowledgement, and many of us do them, and they could even seem a little, you know, performative. But in particular, today I am coming to you from Washington, D.C. And I think it's really appropriate when we consider what happened here and what is about to happen here in a month, that we really think about the history and legacy and how do we come to be here. So this land acknowledgement, we want to convene that the land that is now Washington, D.C. was the ancestral home of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. These people were forcibly displaced in the 1600s after ceding land to the United States government in an unfair treaty. And so if you would like to find your own ancestral space that I encourage all of us to think about, you can go to nativelands.ca. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about and what is morality? And I found this quote by Thomas Jefferson and I fact-checked it. And he was actually writing to his good friend who was the governor of New Hampshire in 1810, and it says, money, not morality, is the principal commerce of civilized nations. And it was a critique, but I also thought it was telling. The fact that central to, and this was in 1810, very, very shortly after the emancipation, after the Declaration of Independence, but before the Emancipation Proclamation, was speaking to the centrality of capital in American life. And it has proven that was how it was founded. And today we are living with just that forming that money is the principal commerce of this nation. Next slide, please. And so I won't go over this because it has been said so eloquently. Jonathan, I loved your framing at the beginning, the polycrisis, the predatory capitalism that has brought us to this moment. John Fullerton, I could listen to you speak all day around the regenerative economy and just explaining that so we can move on. And so when we speak about, and when I speak about reparations, I'm particularly concerned about reparations for the Africans who were trafficked and enslaved to create our modern capitalist system. Slavery was what formed the modern world. It was the savior, I would want to say, in 1400, the first conquest that's documented between Europe and Africa was European, particularly Portuguese, in search of wealth going to Africa. And so that idea of capturing wealth and looking for wealth, and first it was gold, and then there were the bodies of the Africans who were then trafficked all throughout the New World. And it was the labor and bodies of enslaved Africans that actually created the new world of North, Central, and South America. In the United States, we know that it was the foundation of the wealth. And we note that in 1860, 5 years before, in the midst of the Civil War and 5 years before the enslaved Africans were emancipated, the economic worth of the 4 million bodies was $4 billion, and that surpassed the combined value of all of the United States banks, railroads, and factories of the time. So when you think about how this wealth of this nation has been secured, it is on the backs and the bodies of the enslaved. And yet still, we also note that we have never had a serious discussion about reparations, much less have we had any reparative activities taking place. One of we're familiar with the term 40 acres and a mule, and actually that was promised to the enslaved that if you help the Union to win this war and keep the Union together, we will provide you and your family 40 acres and a mule to start your life. That at the time amounted for 400 acres of land, 400,000 acres of land. They started to distribute that. The Confederacy got upset, and those lands were never distributed to Africans, but were actually redistributed back to the Confederacy. And an additional 2 million acres were given to newly arriving Europeans. Why is that important? We speak to a debt that is yet unpaid. We speak to an acknowledgement of harm that we have done nothing meaningfully from, if we just start the clock ticking from emancipation to the present time, to address the legacy of what is owed and to close that racial wealth gap that was founded on the extraction and theft of the labor of from the bodies of Africans, built on the theft of the lands of the native people. Next slide, please. So what has been the afterlife of the slavery and economic disinvestment in today's communities? How is that shown up? We see that white households have a median wealth of $187,000 on average, around $200,000, compared to $14,000 for Black households. And this is irrespective of education. We found there's a recent study in 2021 by the New York City Comptroller that found that a white high school graduate in New York City had more wealth than a Black college or even graduate degree holding worker. Historic systemic racial exclusion, and that is a fact of our modern life. We look at the fact that Black children, even those born to middle-class parents, have a heightened risk of downward economic mobility. These are all moral quandaries. These are all beyond just economic facts and figures, but they speak to an immoral organizing of our economic life and our economic considerations. I see that I have a time check, and I just want to turn over to Pedro to speak about what we have been looking at working together, which is a way to scope the problem at the scale of repair. Pedro.
Thank you so much, Enith. And so, hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you all. My name is Pedro, and among other things, I serve as a director for Shifting Trillions at the Sierra Club Foundation, which is the independent fiscal sponsor of the better-known Sierra Club. And while I'll get to that in a moment, I want to build on what Enith is saying, because so much of the gravity of it has to do with the difference between the world we have and the world that's possible. And in discussing this, I want to distinguish between capital and capitalism. So capitalism is a set of ideas about how to organize society, and capital is a tool. It can be used to break or to repair. And when we think about capital, we should think of it not only as financial, but in each of its most important forms: financial, relational, and intellectual. And Shifting Trillions is about how we use capital, relational, financial, and intellectual to move as quickly as possible towards the world we all deserve. And that's a large part of the work that we did in partnership at the foundation and on the Shifting Trillions work with Enith and the Reparations Finance Lab. And part of the reasoning for this is that the idea behind Shifting Trillions is not as radical as it sounds, because it's actually been done before. And so the systems we have today were created by Shifting Trillions, as Enith so eloquently described. Our modern industrial system has shifted thousands of trillions of dollars out of our natural systems to produce about 1/10 of that value, according to some recent studies. Our post-colonial system, the same system that told my own great-great-grandparents that they were fools for creating a culture that lived with nature rather than against it, and embracing the human spirit rather than dismissing it, has shifted trillions of dollars in value away from the global south and towards the global north. Trillions in value off of the backs of people and onto stolen land. And that shift was a moral failure, as well as a practical failure. So the practical failure was one that deprived us of some of the best ideas and approaches to the world our species has ever had. Ideas and approaches that allowed us to protect and preserve the systems that keep us alive and have kept us alive for tens of thousands of years. To raise people with a sense of purpose from childhood and imbue the human spirit with the ability to flourish. These ideas of holisticism and regeneration were things that were inherent to these communities for, again, tens of thousands of years. And they were approaches which took to be inherent our deeply interwoven relationship with the world and with each other. The moral failure, on the other hand, has brought us the situation we're in because it created a liability economy rather than a true asset-based economy, because it created a society that was built on taking without giving and building without understanding and destroying long-term value rather than creating it. And so capital, whether that's money, ideas, or relationships, can be a powerful tool for moving in a different direction. With it, we can create systems that recognize people and the planet as the most important sources and beneficiaries of value, as the reason for it all, and treat them accordingly. And that isn't simply a moral case, but a practical one. So what we really need is to understand that stewards of capital are also stewards of value. The value inherent to this planet and its systems that keep us alive, this planet that is our home, and the value inherent to the human being and the human family we're all a part of as leaders to have a duty of care for. So to limit that idea of stewardship to very limited ideas and views of what you can extract from that home and family is to limit and create a world built on the destruction rather than protection of value. And that's the exact opposite of stewardship. So to create that world we all deserve, where everyone can live in healthy communities with just and regenerative economic systems, on a thriving planet, that is to be a good steward. And that's the work of Shifting Trillions. So Shifting Trillions is made up of the 3 pillars on the screen. First is shifting practice, to leverage the role of asset owning institutions as stewards of value, and to be a steward of value, to have fiduciary responsibilities, whether they're to clients, shareholders, or a vision, is to have responsibilities to protect social and environmental systems that all financial systems depend on. Second is shifting thinking, to help more people understand the role of capital in our world, and importantly, the need for transformation in the dominant approaches to global crises, and that this transformation will not come from the worldviews and ideas that have brought us this crisis in a few short centuries, but that we must learn from the people and approaches that have been treated for too long as the world's human capital and inconveniences, the people and ideas that brought us the vibrancy of the Amazon and the cradle of our species. And finally is shifting power. Shifting Trillions is not possible alone, but if we can build a movement of key leaders, decision makers, and change makers across all sectors, we can make that transformation happen. And that is the work I've been honored to do in my current role, in partnership with transformative visionaries like Enith and her team at Reparations Finance Lab. I would be equally excited to build that world that we all deserve with all of you. So I'll pass it back to Enith, and thank you all for your time.
Yes, Pedro, if we can just have our slide about reparations is the work for all of us. And we'll close with that slide.
Enith and Pedro, thank you so much. And now, Anna.
Thanks, Jonathan. To say these are hard acts to follow is a complete understatement. But I am so honored to be in these conversations with everyone. So I was asked to share a view of the field of economic systems transformation from the vantage point of the New Capitalism Project, which I co-lead. And there are 2 main points I'd like to emphasize in my time with you. First is how NCP is relentlessly focused on building a strong and healthy ecosystem of leaders and organizations to intervene in a broken system, to go through this metamorphosis, as John framed it. And second, why this way of operating requires that we fundamentally redesign how we finance systems transformation work. So I'm going to talk about both of these things, focusing more on the how, what it takes to work in complex adaptive systems, first by talking about trees. And you may be wondering, what can a grove of aspens teach us about transforming systems? As it turns out, quite a lot. This is a picture of Pando, which is a grove of aspen trees in Utah that is one of the largest and oldest living organisms in the world. Pando spans 106 acres. It connects over 50,000 aspens, weighs a whopping 7,500 tons, and is estimated to be 9,000 years old. Imagine yourself standing inside this grove of trees, feeling the wind, listening to the quaking leaves above. It's pretty spectacular, right? But now look down. Something quieter, even more powerful and spectacular is happening beneath your feet and invisible to the untrained eye. And the key to Pando's scale, health, and longevity is its vast, interconnected, interdependent root system, which, if you straightened it out, would wrap halfway around the world. It is this root system that plays invaluable and life-sustaining roles for this vast grove of trees. What exactly does it do? It coordinates energy production to trees throughout the forest. It is the grove's communication system. It is its nutrient transfer system. It provides defense and regeneration for all of the trees. It is magnificent in its scale. So what does any of this tree talk have to do with transforming systems? Pando teaches us that the health of any system comes from and is dependent on a healthy root system. And if we want to catalyze and grow what's above, the trees, the branches, the leaves, we need to attend to what's below. So you may be asking, what does all of this tree talk have to do with the New Capitalism Project? Bear with me. Like a grove of trees, NCP is an ecosystem of leaders and their organizations and funders who are working to shift the economic system by shifting the norms, rules, behaviors, and practices of financial and business sector leaders. Our geography or our place is the capital markets, which has no zip code. It's everywhere and nowhere. Like Pando's root systems, NCP helps a vast and distributed ecosystem of leaders and organizations and funders work together in infinitely more connected, iterative, relational, and mutually reinforcing ways. We were launched in 2020, and at this point, we are purely a philanthropic and nonprofit play. We are hosted by the Global Impact Investing Network and have been supported by a range of philanthropic entities on this journey of economic systems transformation. The fundamental question NCP is asking is, what will it take, and all of us are asking on this call, what will it take to transform our toxic and underachieving economic system from one that is, fair to say, advantages the prosperity, opportunity, and comfort of a few at the expense of the many, extracts as much value and profit as possible from people and the planet, that perpetuates the advantage of a few at the top, also at the expense of the many, and undermines our economic vibrancy, democratic viability, and we would argue our basic humanity. To a place where we've dismantled an economy that's rooted in this utterly false hierarchy of human value, where we've reoriented away from this pernicious mindset of hyper-individualism and hyper-growth to one of interdependence and sustainable progress, an economy that is built, as we heard from Enith and Pedro, on a foundation based in acknowledgement, accountability, and active repair for injustices committed against Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities, where well-being of the collective, including our planet and future generations, replaces profit and individual net worth as a primary measure and driver of success. But making the transition from here to there demands a lot. It demands, we understand, certainly two critical aspects of what it means to dance with systems, as the great Donella Meadows taught us. First, realizing that by working to transform our economic system, we're operating in a highly complex, adaptive environment that is unpredictable, hard to control, nonlinear, emergent, and evolving. By its very nature, it defies quick fix, isolated solutions. And it compels us to be honest about evaluating all the business as usual change strategies that we've developed over basically a century of doing philanthropy that don't really have a chance of working in this context. Second, we also have to understand that we're in a vast problem-solving ecosystem made up of a just enormous amount of distributed, highly fragmented set of leaders, organizations of all kinds, nonprofit and for-profits, and a whole set of interventions, networks, movements, initiatives, theories of the problem, theories of change, all working in their silos to try and fix this economic system. It gets really messy really fast. And this messiness is compounded when we understand the specific challenges preventing the field of economic systems change, right? This vast root system to achieve a level of coherence, coordination, and action, we actually need to drive deep change. Challenges such as the 5 you can see on the slide that we identified when we launched NCP, a lack of a shared vision, right? To galvanize and mobilize a growing movement of leaders. We heard there's over 120 terms for something better and some kind of new economy. Insufficient field awareness is the Achilles heel of greater movements, right? Who's doing what where? How are we connected? How are we not connected? Where are we over-indexing as a field? Where are we under-indexing as a field? Insufficient collaboration and connection around ideas and the people leading them, allowing bigger and more coordinated swings to manifest that shared vision and move away from the distributed and fragmented activity that really hampers a field's health. And certainly lack of funding for collaboration and what we think of as the enabling conditions that support ongoing systems health. And finally, the reason NCP exists is because we know a lack of a field's infrastructure, kind of the utilities that are able to maintain and sustain processes to support ecosystem level strategic discussions, connections, shared visioning, collective action, and collective learning among an ever-growing ecosystem. And to do all of this work over time, not in the 1 to 2 year grant cycles we tend to operate in. These are pretty formidable challenges at the field level that we need to tend to if we want to support healthy forest, of activity. And for the past 4 years, NCP has been relentlessly focused on these challenges. And in that process, we've built and are building with many on this call, this kind of critical stack of assets and activities, what we think of as this dynamic kind of interaction and flywheel between several critical layers, mobilizing a growing community of leaders who are already intervening in this system, building a true movement ecology of interventions, supporting this community in the development of their shared vision as they create a larger story and have the agency to evolve this vision for what's needed beyond the toxic and underachieving system we have. Engaging leaders in building the field level strategy, right? How do we move from individual theories of change to collective strategies and theories of change to manifest that vision, laddering up to a bigger story of change behind our individual organizational mandates? And this then allows us to develop a portfolio of integrated interventions to launch behind the identified barriers to that vision. And equally important, honoring and supporting and resourcing the more connected and coordinated ways leaders are willing to work in through what we're calling clusters of collaboration that will work to defy the more common kind of fragmentation, isolation, and honestly, the kind of Hunger Games mentality most nonprofits have to operate in. So all of this may sound really great. Who wouldn't want this? The rub is that the bulk of the attention, resources, and funding and social change work is really directed at what we see and hence what we value, right? That is the individual projects, maybe a tree or a leaf or a branch, or maybe even just a twig in the grove of social change. And too little funding, and sometimes none, goes to the invisible, quote unquote, interconnections among and enabling conditions among people and projects and the practices that we know are key drivers of a system's health and therefore its transformation. And today we try to do all of this ecosystem work under really the tyranny of a point solution financing structure that was developed over 100 years ago in philanthropy, where really the dominant way of funding social change tends to look something like this, right? Funding goes to important but discrete and often unconnected projects. And we cross our fingers and cross our toes and kind of hope that they'll ladder up to systemic transformation. It's a perfect kind of funding approach when the problem and solutions are known, when we're dealing with kind of technical problems. However, it's an imperfect funding approach for dealing with complex adaptive systems. And what we need is a system health financing architecture that's purposefully built to fuel an ecosystem of actors and interventions, working, experimenting, learning, and adapting together to manifest their shared vision for a healthier system. And so the question really becomes, how do we do that? How do we design financing vehicles that meet the conditions of the complexity we're operating in? And we've heard some great ideas from those who have talked in this presentation before. How do we move from funding that's based in this kind of predictive, linear, and atomized view of the world to one that recognizes and is purpose-built to face the uncertainty, the complexity, and emergence we work in, that shifts away from a fixing and solving a problem mindset to one rooted in healing and transforming systems over time? So I'm really excited to share that at NCP, we're halfway through a design process with a set of funders and field leaders from our network to prototype what we're calling a Pando Fund in honor of the power of Pando and what it teaches us about system health. And ultimately, we envision a funding landscape filled with many Pando funds working in a variety of geographies on a range of issues, engaging leaders committed to intervening in our most intractable and broken systems. And really that empower all of us to better see and better act on the health of those systems, both their interwoven roots and the beautiful quaking canopies that we see above ground. So I'm so excited to be in this conversation with all of you, and I look forward to seeing where this groundswell takes us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Fantastic. And Dominic, tell us about systems change investing.
Yes, hello. I'll be an echo of what you just heard in many different ways. Thanks for having me. I'm calling in from the Swiss Alps. I'm based in Switzerland. And at this time of year, it's beautiful, but it's also cold. So I spend a lot of my time at the moment thinking about how to operate a furnace and how heat moves through a house. That's the context in which I'm giving this presentation. And Switzerland is known not just for mountains, but for many other things as well, including cheese and chocolate. And this thing here, which is a Swiss Army knife. The one I have here was given me at the basic training of the Swiss Armed Forces. So it's an actual Swiss Army issued Swiss Army knife. And it's got four tools that serve 7 functions collectively, like opening a bottle or cutting. And the Swiss Army knife really represents the future of impact investing, philanthropy, and development finance. And why that is, I will tell you as part of my presentation. But first, let's look at what the present of these fields look like. And we're going to use the American food system as an example. Here's a visual impression of the American food system. Oh, sorry, jumped the gun on this one. It's characterized by industrial meat production, intensive agriculture, and ultra-processed foods, and it contributes to climate change, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, and obesity. And here's an AI's vision of a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. Now, to go from the previous picture to this one, we need a particular quality of change. Not incremental change of the kind we get with marginal improvements, such as new technologies, but deep and structural change to the way we grow, process, consume, and dispose of food. In other words, what we need is systems transformation. And most impact investors would subscribe to this transformative vision, but are actually not well positioned to catalyze this kind of change. And that's because they operate from the standpoint of a single type of money. For some of you in the audience today, that's probably market rate investment capital or concessional capital or non-repayable grants. For those working in corporations, it can be balance sheet investments or supply chain finance. And for those working in the public sector, it could be public procurement and subsidies. If we work with a single type of money, we tend to scan the landscape of investable opportunities through the specific lens shaped by this capital type. So VCs see startups in alternative protein and precision agriculture. Infrastructure investors see food processing facilities and agri-photovoltaic plants. Real estate investors see farmland and green buildings. Carbon market specialists see biochar projects. And foundations see community centers, capacity building programs for farmers, or awareness campaigns for consumers. Looking at the system through a narrow lens allows us to identify some of the nodes in the system, but only those that fit our very specific lens. We'll miss all the other nodes, the connections between those nodes, the leverage points, and the emergent properties of the system at large. To see the full system, we need a systems lens. And the components of this lens come from applied systems thinking, systems science, complex systems science, and systems innovation. And with this lens, we can bring the full complexity of a system into view and uncover its secrets. Here's an example from our prototyping work around regenerative agriculture in the American Midwest. Shout out to Anna and the team at the New Capitalism Project for enabling this work. What you see is a transitions map. And this transitions map is a cross between a causal loop diagram and the theory of change. And it's got a problem layer, a solution layer, and an actor layer. This map lets us see nodes and relationships and helps us understand where exactly the system's financing needs lie. With those insights, we can then develop a capital allocation strategy for moving the system from its extractive and unsustainable status quo to a more regenerative future. creating this map has led us to some surprising findings. It turns out that the transformation of this particular system is less about developing new farming technologies or food products, which is where most of today's impact investing energy is. Instead, what this system needs most is capacity building for farmers, changes in the underwriting practices of insurance companies, more food processing infrastructure in the middle of the supply chain, and market building through advanced market commitments from companies further downstream in the value chain. Importantly, these things aren't needed as a loose collection of isolated solutions, or as what Anna referred to as single point solutions, but as part of integrated portfolios designed to work in specific places in supply chains. Because in some sense, all systems are local, and so context matters. Adopting a systems lens means that we will see more beyond the horizon of a single financial lever, but simply seeing more isn't where it stops. Because once we see the full picture, we find ourselves compelled to change the doing of capital deployment, which brings us back to the Swiss Army knife. But to grasp the knife's relevance, we need to understand that systems change is rarely the result of a single technology, a single piece of physical infrastructure, or a single social enterprise. Instead, it most often results from the combined effects of many shifts, interrelated shifts happening within a system concurrently and in strategic alignment across domains such as technology, business models, education, policy, social norms and behavior, etc. Meaning, if we want to change a system, we need to intervene in many different places of that system at once. And the myriad of interventions that need to be made tend to have their own unique funding needs. Some are perfectly investable with market rate investment capital or catalytic capital. Others require grants. Still others require risk transfer mechanisms like insurance and advanced market commitments. And many need changes in the tax codes and in subsidy schemes. So the challenge of funding systems transformation boils down to, first, creating a funding architecture that spans multiple types of capital and is anchored in the system's actual financing needs, and then matching the right kind of capital with the right kind of intervention at the right moment in time. Or in other words, knowing which tool of your Swiss Army knife to use for solving a specific problem. And this is not at all how purpose-driven finance works today. Usually, investors don't start with the needs of a system, but with their own capability and the money at their disposal. So if I'm a venture capitalist with access to VC, I'm going to start a venture capital fund, whether or not the system I want to change actually needs more venture capital. So shifting the impact objective from systems optimization to systems transformation has profound implications for the practice of capital deployment. It requires that we build strategic investment portfolios, not just thematic ones, in which we try to unlock the combinatorial effects that arise when investees and grantees are brought into synergistic alignment with each other. It also requires that we rethink how investment and funding vehicles are designed in terms of governance, incentives, fees, etc. It asks of us to build coalitions across the private, public, and philanthropic sectors and collaborate not only on a deal-by-deal basis, as you tend to see in blended finance structures, but in long-term partnerships, ideally organized by financial backbone organizations that generate the systemic intelligence, convene the coalition, orchestrate the capital deployment, that you should be hearing echoes from both Anna's and Samantha's presentations here. And it requires us to measure and manage impact very differently, to look at overall system health and not at the specific output of individual assets. So enter some organizations pioneering this way of working. Builder's Vision, in its Oceans strategy, works across the entire capital spectrum. They deploy grants, catalytic capital, and market rate investment capital into research institutes, NGOs, startups, and established companies to build the components of a sustainable blue economy. The Fink family has worked with the same kind of multi-capital approach to tackle the food waste problem in the United States. And the Groundbreak Coalition uses a mix of grants, guarantees, and concessional capital to close the racial wealth gap in Minneapolis-St. Paul by supporting Black people in becoming homeowners and entrepreneurs. These are pioneering efforts, but as examples of systemic investing, they're still in their infancy. So what lies ahead for us collectively is the task of building the infrastructure for systemic investing. That means doing the research to develop the methods, tools, and impact measurement frameworks, running and scaling prototypes to better understand what systemic investing could look like in practice, and then building the field through education and convening, publishing handbooks so that systemic investing can become the new paradigm at the core of impact investing, philanthropy, and development finance. And not just for transforming food systems, but also to address climate change, biodiversity loss, poverty, mental illness, and all other environmental and social problems that are fundamentally complex and systemic in nature. Now, I'm going to close with an anecdote. An impact investor recently told me that it's likely that our portfolio will be vastly impactful, but that the health of the system we care about will still deteriorate. And this captures well what's going on today. A lot of impact investors and foundations have very impressive success stories to tell, and yet 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, which are system-level outcomes, are being breached, and 83% of SDGs are not on track. So what we're doing is creating islands of sustainability in a sea of the polycrisis. What gives me hope is that we virtually have all the solutions, the individual components we need to build that low-carbon, climate-resilient, just and inclusive future that we want. But the key question is, how will it all come together? Because if we are to change entire systems, developing those single-point solutions won't be enough. These things also need to ladder up. We need to learn how to move from sort of spinning the threads to weaving the cloth. And to be able to do such weaving, we need to adopt the systems lens. We need to take a Swiss Army knife approach to capital deployment. And we all need to evolve into systemic investors. And that's it for me.
Dominic, thank you so much. And this systems view of life is permeating all of our discussions. That's a great example of it. The other thing that permeates all of our discussions at the Garrison Institute, and this is the Garrison Institute program, is compassion. Liz, talk to us about economics and compassion.
Wonderful. So let me share my screen. And thank you so much, because there was such an extraordinary wealth of knowledge and ideas. And thank you, Dominic, for just bringing us to this point of knowing that there's so much more we can do, that it's a radical change. So the question is, compassion, what's love got to do with it? And I think you've heard it's got to do, there's a huge amount it's got to do with it. Because we need to do something very different. Dominic, you talked about the planetary boundaries, and I don't need to go over this, that we're in this polycrisis, this triple planetary crisis, a triple health crisis, a triple societal crisis. But the key thing that we've said in each presentations is that the economies, the financial sector, are part and parcel of the problem, but also potentially part and parcel of a solution if there's transformation. The reason I've put this here is that we can often describe this polycrisis we're in, but do we think about the fact that behind it lies not just data, not just debt, but actually pain and brokenness? And that's hard, because pain and brokenness are not really what are economies like to consider. We like to fix what's there as opposed to thinking, where is the pain and brokenness at the heart? Suffering is how we all experience pain. The work of our economies, and we've heard this throughout, is not now about fixing the downstream consequences. It's about moving somewhere different. If we reflect on the immensity and the omnipresence of these triple crises, destroying all of the social cohesion that we know, then disconcertingly, there are actually very, very few activities that all of us engage in within the economic sector, within the financial sector, that don't have consequences for suffering, either for, unfortunately, causing or creating or contributing to, or for alleviating. And this is where compassion comes in. Compassion is a word that is bandied about. It's actually probably in so many charters. It's if you listen, you hear compassion on a daily basis mentioned. But how does it connect to economy? Just first, compassion, the word itself, and it's a word in so many different languages, but I'll use thinking of English, and it comes from Middle English, from the Old French, Old Latin, com meaning with, together, and passio meaning suffering. I propose that compassion is a strategy that could help us grow a different type of economy. Compassion builds the social cohesion that's required to underpin an economy that serves people and planet. It offers a response to the how question that we're all talking about. It's a method. It's not a byproduct. Compassion's a choice because it changes us and it changes systems. And it's the systems change part that's so essential. Compassion isn't a nice to have, though, and this is one of the challenges as we talk about compassion, because it's often thought as, oh well, it's all the good things we do outside of the real work. Or compassion is not pity either, and often it gets mixed up with pity. Pity is effectively the enemy of compassion, because it's not about the soft, pleasant smile, the sort of the altruism, the somehow we'll make it nice together. It's very easy to think of a place or think of compassion. We know how compassion feels because we know what it's like to be in compassion circles or to be there. And we also actually know what it's like when compassion is completely missing. And it's quite a frightening thing when we're outside of compassion. Compassion's in our DNA. It's actually the key for human survival. It's probably it's this thing that allowed humanity to grow together. I want you to look at this definition. It's a definition that a great colleague of mine, Monica Warline and Jane Dutton, brought together. And it's asks us to think about compassion as noticing suffering, interpreting suffering, feeling, and then acting to root out the cause of suffering in order to flourish. Noticing suffering. In a way, our whole session has been about noticing what lies behind the facts and the figures, the facade of our connections, our interactions, our chance encounters, noticing the faces. Compassion helps us to truly notice. And when we truly notice suffering, we see something. We see ourselves, we see others, we see a world that's very different. Compassion is about interpreting suffering as well. It's not just walking by and noticing someone in the street or noticing an organisation doesn't feel right. It's about thinking, what's behind that? Why? Interpreting is an essential part understanding of compassion, because it gives us also the right to ask hard questions, courageous questions. Why is there suffering? What part am I playing? What part is our system playing? Where do we go? And then feeling empathetically concerned for what we see, for those who suffer. Now, it's easy to feel empathetically concerned. It's easy to care about those in our family, those around us, those we see. It's so much harder to feel concern and care and love for those who are outside of our system, for those who are outside of our geographical boundaries, for those who are on the other side of the world. And yet, as you mentioned, Dominic, just there at the end, our Sustainable Development Goals are trying to bring together a global response, and they're not working, where every metric is behind, because we know what to do, we know how to do things, we have the resources in the world, but perhaps we don't care. We don't really understand what it is to care. And compassion also is about taking action. And Monica and Jane have really pushed this idea that it's not enough to say, oh, I'm so sorry. That's not compassion. Or I want to be kind and I'll just do this. Compassion is going to the heart of what's happening, taking action to root out the suffering that we see. It's so fundamentally different to what we have done. Compassion shines a light on who we are, where we're going, what it means to belong. It's a thing that fills the space between how we as professionals function and actually how we as people function. Because there shouldn't be a gap. There should be authenticity. There should be integrity. There should be a way of working together. Compassion allows us to better understand the complexities of the system change that we need. If our goals are to act towards ensuring there is flourishing and not the continual crisis, compassion is what gives us that sense of the interdependence of all things. And when we see interdependence and we can understand and begin to connect, we also begin to make sense of the contradictions that we face. And why does this all matter for economy, for the financial sector? You know, the UN in the development reports, and actually very recently the World Economic Forum, talk about trust, equity and environmental sustainability as the foundational critical goals. And we've heard about this all afternoon or all morning for you. But we, the financial sector, are contributing to the distrust, the inequity, the crisis. This is where, if we change, if we look at the ways that compassion offers us, this new way of looking and seeing each other, this new way of looking at systems, this new way of understanding the connections, something remarkably different can happen. There is an irony, you know. The irony is that this isn't new. As I say, compassion is part of our DNA, it's our survival. And the components of compassion appear constantly in every workplace, in every HR policy, as you imagine. It's about team building, it's about investing in wellness, it's about caring for the workforce. But it's so much more than this. We have individualized compassion instead of looking at the system that compassion is and the system that it pushes us towards. There's also a danger because compassion, as I say, it's been off-centered, it's been trivialized. It's also been sometimes described as a contradiction to a thriving economy. It's seen, and I've heard it described as, well, that's the aid part, that's the CSR part, but the real work happens somewhere else. It's aid. You're talking about aid, but we're talking about trade. Without compassion, I suggest we're losing our vision, we're losing out, we're losing the opportunities that are there. Now, I'm from Edinburgh, I'm talking to you from Edinburgh, so I can't help but mention Adam Smith, who is probably Scotland's greatest economist. And we often think of Adam Smith's work around the wealth of nations, but it was actually the theory of moral sentiments that influenced the wealth of nations. And he, with his whole approach, actually tried to drive back to somewhere different. It's not been picked up so much, but he tried to drive back to say it's the fortunes of others and the fortunes of ourselves are connected. It's how we see each other. This matters. Now, he does say it's the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker. It isn't their benevolence that provides our dinners, but it's a sense that we are together, that there are people together, that we're working together in community that changes. But how do we move an alternative system? How do we shift where we have constructed an economy that's man-made, economies that are we have created, but then are now tiptoeing around because we're no longer able to challenge. An economy without compassion leads to so many losses. But there's a reverse as well. Compassion without economies, and compassion that sits out with economies, leads to charity. And this again is what we've been talking about. We can't keep breaking and then anticipate that charities will do the fixing, or that we'll put in, and we are not changing. Change has to happen, as we heard at the very start from Amanda. It's upstream change. It's change at the very beginning, and compassion shows us this. It's not about more food banks, though food banks are essential and they're so important, but it's not about more cooking classes or budgeting tools for those on low incomes, assuming that actually if they just have cooking skills or financial skills, things will be better. I want to tell you about John Bird, Lord John Bird, who actually found it the big issue here in the UK. And he's a member of our House of Lords in the Parliament. But he talked about the fact that thousands of charities to intervene in the lives of the poorest only really keeps poverty ticking over. It doesn't create the system change. If we don't reinvent society, we don't break people from poverty. We create an inheritance of poverty. And that's where compassion comes through. So how do we grasp this opportunity? Frank White, who is the author of the book, The Overview Effect, Space Exploration and Human Evolution, he interviewed a number of astronauts, as you know, and they described this extraordinary moment of having the overview, of looking at Earth from space and seeing interconnectedness, seeing vulnerability, seeing purpose, seeing the power of collaboration. Compassion gives us this overview as well. With compassion, we can see the full potential of working together. We can see abundance when we missed it. We can see something that's purposeful, because compassion at its heart is pushing towards a purposeful life, a purposeful system. Compassion is power giving and powerful. It allows us to work together. It allows risk taking in a way that we need for a change. It's protective, making the economic decisions that we actually need to make, because the decisions that we're making at the minute are destructive. They're coming back to bite us, as we saw with the poly crisis. It's prescient. Caring matters now. And compassion actually gives us a different understanding of profitability. It's not profitability of hoarding financial gains among a very small, distributed in a pitiful way to multiple people. It's profitability of assets that all of us has, the profitability of what nature has given us, profitability of the ability to work together. That requires system change. That is a system change. That requires a new thinking. And extraordinary compassion never will have a supply problem. The more we are compassionate, the more we use compassion as a method to bring about change, the more we see compassion and see through, use compassion as a lens to see where we're at, the greater compassion grows. So just finally, what does this look like in action? This is some of the work we're doing at Edinburgh in our Compassion Hub, but it's about thinking, what would it be like to reimagine and redesign financial services sector where compassion drives decision making, where it fosters inclusivity? What would it be like to understand the ways in which behaviours and within the financial sector and decisions taken by the financial sector actually help us to see people positively, to nurture the land, to pay back what we owe, to live towards the goals that the SDGs are envisage, a place of safety, of security, of peace. What would it look like with compassionate leadership in the workplaces, promoting cultures with compassionate products and services, designing solutions that prioritise community well-being from the start, that pre-distributive work, compassionate technologies and data, creating technologies to foster transparency, to foster those things that we know are missing, particularly trust, compassionate policies and processes, advocating for systemic reforms to enhance outcomes. These are not beyond any of us, because these can be worked at. We know that we are working around the edges of each of these, but what we're calling for today is that revolution, that radical approach that shifts. In conclusion, compassion has become something that we often see, like this image, we often see it as the wonderful and random acts of kindness, the small things, which are so important. But what would it be like to see the system change that you mentioned of Dunella Rivers? What would it be like, as Anel Dash talks about, most of what gets shared as heartwarming stories are temporary, small-scale responses to systemic failures. I wish we found it as inspirational to make structural changes to unjust systems. But I don't know, he says, if our culture knows how to tell those stories. Compassion is, I believe, the story that we could tell, and it gives us the ability to tell the story. Stories bring us together, as Elif Shafik says. Untold stories keep us apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. It's a wonderful framing. And our last speaker is going to take us to Earth. So we've heard a lot about human systems. There's been references to natural systems. But Justin, tell us about climate solutions and the opportunity roadmap.
Thanks so much for having me here today. My name's Justin Winters. I'm the co-founder and executive director of One Earth, and I was asked to join this incredible group of people to share some very specific tools and innovations and things that we're bringing to life to really facilitate the type of radical collaboration that is necessary in this moment. So Jonathan, thank you for bringing us together, and excited to dive into the Q&A after this. The existential work that has driven our work at One Earth for nearly a decade is this: how can we actually solve the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss? And if so, how? Until recently, we had no scientific models that showed if we could realistically achieve the critical goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C with existing solutions. So back in 2017, we kicked off the One Earth research program with over 50 leading scientists and experts across an array of disciplines in an effort to try to answer this top-line question. For our very first major scientific product was the One Earth Climate Model, led by Aerospace Centre, DLR, and University of Technology, Sydney. The model was originally published in 2019 by Springer Nature in a very dense scientific text called Achieving the Paris Climate Agreement Goals. It's 500 pages, so it's certainly a complicated answer, but I can give you the short answer. Yes, it is still in fact possible for us to solve this and to achieve the 1.5 degrees C goal. It won't be easy, obviously, but it is still possible. And then more recently, just about a year and a half ago, a second edition of the model was released, which provides aligned targets usable for the financial sector. We boiled all of this down into 3 pillars that give us clarity about what's required in this moment. And both the One Earth climate model, as well as additional research that we've been spearheading with numerous experts and scientists around the world, leads to 3 core actions that we need to take. We need to transition to 100% clean, renewable energy. We need to protect, connect, and restore 50% of the world's lands and oceans. And we need to shift our food and our fiber systems to regenerative agriculture. Over the past couple of years, we have been working to make this science, this body of science, more actionable and more accessible to everyone. So we broke that down into what you're seeing here, which is the One Earth Solutions Framework. All the colored boxes that you're seeing at the top are the 76 distinct solution pathways across 3 pillars and 12 broad categories. I call this section the what. This is what we need to get done, what we need to invest in, what we need to support, and what we need to scale. At the bottom, you'll see we have listed intersectional themes and levers of change. This section really represents the how we're going to get the action that is necessary done, and done in a way that is both fair and equitable. It's important to note that all of these solutions need to be addressed. There simply is no silver bullet to the complex challenges we're facing. But the good news is that if we do all of this, we can solve our greatest challenges and actually build a vibrant, healthy, and just future. There are several things to our framework that make, actually, to back up for a moment, there are a number of different incredible frameworks, solutions-oriented frameworks out there. But there are a few things that make this one particularly unique and special. It's the only one based on a global climate model that shows how we can achieve the 1.5 degrees C goal with existing solutions. And we intentionally put nature and equity at the center of the proposition in building out this science and this framework. So the good news is we know what needs to be done. But the problem is, for this and for every other solution roadmap, we don't know how much and what kind of money is going to each area. All the money and precious time will be wasted if it's not strategically allocated to the solutions that have been so rigorously defined. So I want to share a little bit about a unique collaboration and partnership that we're taking on with a fellow organization called Vibrant Data Labs that is working to solve this, to create a general method for shining a light on the critical gaps and opportunities across the One Earth solution roadmap. To get started, let me share a little bit about our partners at Vibrant Data Labs and what they've built and what we're going to be doing together. Vibrant Data Labs is a social mission data science company. They created the U.S. Climate Finance Tracker tool, which you're seeing a representation of up here, a publicly available tool that uses data science to help everyone easily see and explore who is funding what. The current version tracks over $370 billion in funding to more than 10,000 US-based climate-relevant companies and nonprofits over the past 5.5 years, from over 14,000 investors and philanthropic donors. For each company and nonprofit, VDL scrapes and summarizes descriptions of what they do from various online sources, and they use their own language to tag them with climate keywords, themes, and sectors. The entire database is visually searchable by any of these attributes, so that everyone can easily see who is funding or doing what, and who to convene or talk to for shared learnings. To our knowledge, there exists no other public resource to easily see in one view both nonprofit organizations and private companies working on solutions spanning not only climate mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience. The original goal of VDL's Climate Finance Tracker tool was simply to enable the discovery of who is funding what. But we got incredibly excited together about how powerful this tool and data could be in the context of the framework that shows us what the planet needs us to do to solve the polycrisis that we face. So earlier this year, we teamed up to apply the One Earth Solutions framework to the Climate Finance Tracker to create the first AI-enhanced climate solutions knowledge base and gap analysis for the financial sector. We are deep in the research data and analysis stage of this project, but the initial results are illuminating, and I wanted to share some of that with you now. So let's start with the top 3 solution pillars. Here is the first ever automated estimate of how much climate venture investments and private philanthropy went to the One Earth Solution pillars of energy and mobility, nature conservation, and fixing the food system. A couple of patterns at this high level are quite clear. Most of the climate relevant funding we've tracked has been investments in energy and mobility technology. While the market momentum here is incredibly exciting and necessary, we will fail if we don't also tackle nature and food. Surprisingly, while philanthropy is generally dwarfed by venture investments in most sectors, philanthropy to nature is more than fivefold that of venture. It's clear that nature is part of the climate solution space that doesn't and may never have fully market-based solutions. So philanthropy has a critical role to play in filling this gap. As an environmentalist who's fought to help protect nature since I was a teenager, if I had the resources to contribute to funding the protection of nature, I would want to break this down to see meaningful gaps and opportunities within that pillar. Now, for the first time, we can automatically redistribute the money to the sub-pillars and the solutions within them. For example, to estimate what fraction of nature-related philanthropy went to each solution area, within each sub-pillar of land conservation, ocean conservation, ecosystem restoration, and wild connectivity. What really stands out is that about 40% of nature conservation philanthropy goes to already protected lands. But these are only 18% of the critical lands that we actually need to conserve, protect, and restore. And less than half of that goes to organizations that mention the intent to address nature conservation with a social justice lens. Here in the shaded part of the bar, it highlights the money going to organizations with explicit social justice language in their descriptions. While we can't infer that they are successfully achieving those social justice outcomes, it's at least a proxy for publicly stated intent by the entities on the ground. Similarly, less than 7% of nature philanthropy goes to organizations supporting Indigenous land tenure, despite the fact that Indigenous peoples steward at least 1/3 of the total lands that science says are critical to keep intact and healthy. If I wanted to contribute into this area, I would also want to know who's inside that bar. In the updated climate finance tracker, all the entities are tagged to their best match to the One Earth solutions so that you can easily see and select those in the Indigenous land tenure section. View them as a list and explore the details of what they do, who funds them, and who to talk to for shared learnings. Our hope is to better integrate this detailed view of individual organizations with a higher level summaries of underfunded gaps. And this honestly is just one example of the insights that we're beginning to see from the data. There are incredibly rich and interesting stories of unexpected gaps and opportunities across all the pillars. And we have some exciting plans to bring all of this science, data, and insights to life and into action in 2025. Right now, we're deep in the research, data, and analysis stage of the project. But in the upcoming year, we plan on publishing the updated version of the One Earth climate model, adding impact scores for each solution pathway, enhancing the climate finance tool, and we're aiming to launch a dynamic interactive report, which will showcase the One Earth Solutions framework, highlight key gaps and opportunities for climate investors and philanthropists, all to drive strategic impact. Ultimately, we're really hoping to galvanize those working across climate finance to move resources more effectively, equitably, and swiftly together. All of this information, in particular around the solutions framework, and is accessible on our website. We've worked really hard to make this deep body of knowledge and content and really inspiring stories about the people driving the changes in their communities and bioregions around the world accessible to everyone. So please, come to our website, check it out, and reach out and be in touch if you're interested in learning more about the current projects that we have underway. And that's it for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Justin. And you showed where the money is. You put the money where our mouths are. Questions. Your amazing audience. We've loaded a lot on you, and So I'd love to, there's some questions in the Q&A, and I encourage other people to propose more questions if there's anything that you wanted to discuss. So, I'm going to start with one from Marco Santori, who says that since Kant, that morality has really been about autonomy and in a way about individuals' roles within the social fabric. His question is, do you find the role of finance in our economies detrimental to this autonomy? And do you see the ability to introduce an exchange system based on moral, organizational, cultural values? And so I'd love, you've all referred to this, any more specifics you have about exchange systems based on moral, cultural, and social values? For example, Justin, you just were talking about financing systems that were really grounded in which biodiversity gain was the central premise, not economics, right?
Sorry, my audio was turned off. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think we're at a moment right now where we have to, I guess I like thinking about it less about planetary boundaries and more about centering life, centering the very life systems that support and make life not only viable, but also beautiful, and have sustained this rich fabric of culture and diverse cultures that have come around the world. So it's a moment for transforming how we think about our economic systems and how they can be in service to life.
And by the way, Jason J adds just a note that the Climate Finance Tracker has added extreme amount of buzz amongst the students at MIT Sloan. But also, Enith, I want your brief view on the morality of our systems, because that's really key to what you've been talking about too.
Yeah, this is just so much. We need to center at all of our considerations humans, not because we think humans are the center of the world, but because we are the ones, as far as we know, who have the capacity to think through what's going on in the world and to think through and enact systems change at the level that we know is important for all of the known world, the known earth to survive. At this moment, and I always leave the possibility that there are things we don't know, it's in our hands. And we know that what we are doing and where we are entering is not going to take us much further. It has harmed in the past, and it's harming in the present, and it will harm in the future all of us in this space. And I loved, just in the framing of what makes life beautiful. What is it that makes life beautiful? It is the sunset. It is the ocean. It's the trees. And we have capacity, and we have destroyed them. We have the capacity to destroy each other, ourselves. But we also have the capacity to think ourselves and act ourselves out of this trap that we have gotten ourselves into. So without, again, centering us as, some superior being, it is in our hands. And we have a fierce, urgent moment in front of us to do something different and include everyone this time. No human left behind, no tree left behind, no animal, no one left behind.
Great. John, this is, I think, a question for you and maybe for Anna. So this question asks about a metamorphosis, and you're the one who used the phrase metamorphosis. Is a new capitalism what we need, or do we need to prepare for something completely different on the other side of the metamorphosis? Is capitalism itself something we need to hospice? And then they ask what became before capitalism and what might be possible afterwards. So John, why don't you start, and then Anna, you follow.
Sure. It's interesting, when I wrote my first piece on regenerative economics, I called it Regenerative Capitalism in 2015, so that people wouldn't ignore me as being some socialist. but the capitalism I'm talking about bears very little resemblance to the capitalism that we experience today. And actually, this is more about how we communicate to different audience than it is about a real system design. I think the more I've thought about this, the more I question that we know as much as we actually think we know. And so I am holding myself open to a metamorphosis. I use the analogy, it's a metamorphosis, but we don't know what the butterfly looks like. And I truly believe that is true. And as just one simple example, I was just on a panel recently where someone gave a very convincing presentation that explained why our entire plans to electrify everything we don't even have enough raw materials to do it once for the 20-year life that all this stuff lasts, much less perpetually into the future. And so we need to begin with resources that we have in abundance. And so this is where, for example, the sodium ion batteries come in. But if we're dependent on sodium ion batteries, we're not going to be driving cars that go 300 miles on a charge. And yet we're charging ahead, mining all the lithium we can and selling lithium batteries as fast as we can. And so I just think, and he used, by the way, he used the phrase industrial permaculture as a way to think about real solutions. And that just, to me, really resonates. And so I think we need to remain extremely humble and have faith in the process of how life works and focus on creating the conditions for health, as opposed to placing too much confidence in our current thinking about solutions.
Thanks, Anna.
So I think this question brings us back to the beginning of the conversation we had before we even opened the webinar, which was, what do you call this movement? What do you call this groundswell? What do we name it? What is the language we use? What language works? What language doesn't work? And for those who weren't privy to that conversation that the panelists were having, there literally is something like 125 names for something that is signifying something better, different than what we currently have. And from the vantage point of the New Capitalism Project, we wrestled with this as we said, well, we have to name our things something. And we recognize there's over 100 ways of, adjectives to describe that something on the other side of what we currently have. So we just called it new. We didn't, which felt like a kind of somewhat neutral term. But I think to John's point, which I love, this notion of a metamorphosis, we don't know what shape the butterfly's wings will be, what color they will be, what pattern it will be on its wings. But we know, I think we're all aligned behind the analysis that what we have doesn't work. And so I think from a New Capitalism perspective, it's like, and we're only going to know what it is by acting our way into it, right? And truly saying, we need to, I think many organizations on this call have a version of what a new capitalism could look like, what a new economic system could look like, what that transformation could look, smell, taste, and feel like. And I think we're so eager just to act our way and learn our way and adapt our way towards that future. And words are never gonna all collapse behind the perfect term. And I think if we do, that's just gonna allow us to just procrastinate and just talk about words and not move towards what we need.
Thank you. Amanda, there are two questions for you. So the first one from Delilah is, what are you thinking about reaching out to progressive and getting out of the progressive echo chamber? And how do we reach to the conservative or right wing who are also rejecting establishment? And then there's a second question for you, which is AI is sweeping through everything like a hurricane right now, causing large companies to back off former climate commitments, et cetera, et cetera. So how are the WEALL governments responding to AI? So first one is about how do we reach the non-progressive echo chamber? Second one is AI.
So with the first question, I mean, I feel quite lucky, actually. I grew up in a very small rural town. So a lot of my friends and family members are more conservative and Trump supporters. And I did, in genuine curiosity, right? I just want to understand a lot of what motivated and it was often the economy. They'd say the economy. But our discussion of the economy is quite different here, obviously. And so I think it's important to just acknowledge that, at least in the US, let's say right now, most people are really struggling. Yeah, like my sister is a teacher who works all weekends at a bar in order to just be able to pay for her insurance, and is still in debt because she can't cover a mortgage, right? So, I mean, we have a system which is very expensive and people's basic needs are not secured. And that was something working with WEALL, where a lot of our work was maybe started more in Europe, and the environment is the starting point for economic systems change. Oftentimes when I'm communicating with people here, it's at best sort of like an afterthought, and at worst as viewed as in conflict with the more urgent needs for security. But the issue is that oftentimes I think the narrative has been that in order to provide that security, we're going to do it through government handouts. But people don't want handouts. They want to have jobs that are meaningful and purposeful, that they contribute to society and also provide them with the necessary foundation. So I think a lot of this is about a different narrative, which is really genuinely empowering for people, but also starts first and foremost at the security that they're really yearning for through their own voice. And so that's why I really believe a lot in the importance of participatory, genuinely participatory, deliberative democratic process, as opposed to that sort of standard redistributive one. The question around AI, my goodness, is a big one. And I don't know that I am the right person to respond to this. I know that it's obviously something that many governments are really wrestling with at the moment in terms of not only disruptions to the labor market, but also in terms of data, security, data privacy, the massive expansion of just even the market for our personal data, the attention economy. There's a lot of dimensions to this. And like most governments, I think, if I'm going to be totally honest with you, it's the tech sector is the one who's we should really do something about this. This is a bad idea. And the governments are I don't know. Let's see how it goes. And maybe we'll do something about it later, So I don't think that they're probably being super proactive about any sort of regulation at the moment, if I'm being honest. But hopefully, yeah, we'll see some movement soon.
Okay. Liz. And Samantha, I see your hand up, but just 1 second. The Joanne Page, who says our current worldwide refugee migrant crisis will increasingly be driven by climate change, making vast swaths of land unlivable. What are we going to do about it? And how do you think compassion can transform our response to it?
Yes, and just picking up, you're right. This planetary crisis is urgent because all the solutions we have so far, not what we were talking about this afternoon, but the solutions that are being thrown in are solutions that have come out of a system that is already corrupted, because we can't get to the source of where the problems are. We are constantly dealing, as I was saying, downstream with the issues, and this is one terrible place where we're dealing downstream, where we're trying to work with refugees who have come out of countries. We're working at the humanitarian sector rather than putting the interventions in that are going to the mitigating interventions in that can change. Compassion, I believe compassion's radical. Compassion's not about charity. It's something about turning our whole system to look at who we are and how we are in a different way. But compassion it's not just simply allows us to look differently. It gives us the strength, the resource to do it. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but we can't, and I think all our talks today have said this, we can't keep going on the way we have, assuming that we can create the solutions. And our climate community at the minute, with mitigation and adaptation and the co-benefits, are actually still working on a trajectory based in a model of finance as we beg the financial system to help us to change.
Right. Samantha, you had your hand raised.
I did. I wanted to come in on this AI question, and also maybe the question around capitalism and what do we call it, and what is the new thing we're calling in. And we think in terms of the potential for a biodiversity of economies to be created. And indeed, that's how economies were structured before colonialism and before we got the monoculture capitalism that we're living under today, that is commodifying things as quickly as possible and sucking up the earth and turning it into money. And so we at the BioFi Project believe that there is this collective intelligence in place that is held by the more than human life in that place, held by the communities in that place, that is needed to inform the design of a place-based economy. And I would argue that there's never been more urgency to transition to these bioregional place-based economies in the face of AI. My friend Nate Higgins talks about how AI is just going to accelerate all the processes that are already underway, and it's going to create a lot more efficiencies in that sucking up the earth and turning it into money. And so to disrupt that process, we have to change the economic system that the AI is being deployed within. And I think there is a very positive role that AI can play if it's deployed to serve the regeneration of a particular place. But right now, it's mostly being deployed to make more profits for companies.
Thank you, Samantha. And I love this idea of the biodiversity of economies. So we're about to end, but Dominic, the last word's going to go to you. Roberto Schifo asked about waste, and essentially the waste that we see in a variety of different industries. And when you think about systems, what you were showing was about interconnecting a range of systems. So do you see how systems thinking can actually reduce or eliminate the issue of waste?
Look, so we've been trying to tackle the waste problem for decades, right? And there's been so much resources, so much effort going into conceptualizing and experimenting with and trying to implement circular economic models. And yet, with maybe the exception of recycling, which works in some places, but not in others, we haven't really made much progress. And circularity is the quintessential systems play. And a lot of, from the perspective of where we stand, a lot of the attempts at implementing circularity fail because of the inability to make things happen, different things happen in systems simultaneously. Because you can't just build out one node in the system without the other nodes being ready, right? You need all the nodes working synergistically. And one of the reasons is the single asset paradigm of funding and investment. You build a plant, or you fund a startup, or you create the waste collection effort. But what is it? What uses it if you have a waste collection mechanism if you have no processing plant, right? So, but these things require different types of financing. And so you have to have an ability to deploy a multitude of capitals to fund multiple things in the systems of different kind using different kinds of money, right? Otherwise, it's not going to come together. So we think this idea of thinking and acting systemically of systemic capital deployment could hold one of the keys in making the circular economy viable, but it's only a hypothesis at this point, and we don't want to sort of over promise because there's other barriers to this issue. But yeah, I mean, if we're not going to get sort of cooked by climate change, we're gonna suffocate by waste. So there's no alternatives to tackling that issue too.
Well, thank you all so much, panelists. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us. It's been a long time. Anthony Allen made a wonderful comment saying that it's been a mesmerizing conversation. There's really nice comments coming in through the chat. Keep sending them because our panelists deserve to get all the applause that they can. And thank you all for this. This has been recorded. We will make a YouTube out of this so you can circulate it to anybody who think. And I so appreciate the richness of the conversation. Thank you all.